Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, all praise and thanks belong to God, the Lord of the world. May peace and blessings be upon Prophet Muhammad, his family, his companions, and all of God's prophets and messengers. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you. This is Edward Ahmed Mitchell, welcoming you to today's episode of CAIR on Air. Thank you so much for joining us. A special thank you to our listeners on American Muslim 360. We hope all of you are doing well and staying safe. As always, if you have any questions you'd like to pose during this program or comments you want to make, just put them in the comment section on Facebook and we'll try to address any questions that we get during the program, inshallah. And if you have any ideas for future programs you want us to address, email us at info@cair.com. Today's program is part 2 of a discussion that we started on Monday about what is happening in Afghanistan. You all have seen the news. You all know what's happening in broad strokes. We don't need to review that. But today we're going to discuss 2 topics. We're going to get a more in-depth, nuanced look at the situation in Afghanistan from an expert on this issue. We've heard from a lot of armchair experts and armchair warriors and people who have no expertise or knowledge of Afghanistan over the past few days. We want to hear from some experts. So we're going to do that for the first part of the program. And then for the second part of the program, inshallah, we're going to continue that kind of conversation about the misuse of Islamic terminology that we're once again seeing in America, in the media, in the wake of what's happening in Afghanistan. We're going to discuss that issue with an Alima, an expert female Muslim scholar, and we're going to discuss that issue with her during the second part of the program. But first, we are going to begin, inshallah, with our special guest. And again, for the first part of the program, we're going to be discussing Afghanistan, inshallah. I'd like to bring on our first guest, Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. Brother Hanifi, Professor, welcome.
Salam, Ahmed, happy to be here.
Wa alaikum salam. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me briefly introduce you. Well, it won't be brief because you've done so much, but let me introduce you. Professor Hanifi is a professor of history at James Madison University, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and South Asia. Professor Hanifi received a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a PhD from the University of Michigan. His dissertation formed the basis of a Gutenberg Prize from the American Historical Association that resulted in his first book, Connecting Histories in Afghanistan. Professor Hanifi's research and publications have addressed subjects including colonial political economy, the history of printing, the Pashto language, photography, cartography, animal environmental studies, and Orientalism in Afghanistan. His primary current projects are a conference and publication series focusing on the early 19th century British Indian scholar administrator, and as well as an environmental history of Afghanistan in that area. Professor Hanifi served as the treasurer of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies from 2003 to 2015, and he is currently serving on the South Asia Council of the Association for Asian Studies and on the Board of Trustees of the American Institute of Indian Studies. In addition to the AHA, he has received research grants from the Social Science Research Council, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, the Asian Development Bank, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. In other words, Professor Hanifi is exactly the type of person we want to have on to discuss these issues in more in depth and with nuance. Professor Hanifi, thank you again so much for joining us.
Pleasure is mine.
So let's dive right in. So first question. We're seeing what's happening in Afghanistan. So we all know the Taliban has taken over most of Afghanistan's provinces. The Afghan government, the US-backed government has collapsed and is essentially no longer in existence. And the American government is evacuating diplomats and other American citizens via Kabul airport. And many Afghans are trying to get to that airport and evacuate as well. So can we just back up, Professor, and just give us a little history lesson of how we got to this point and what factors contributed to the situation we are seeing today? And I'll defer to you to go back as far back in history as you want. I know we could literally go back probably a century or two, but I'll defer to you to go back as far as you think we need to go back to get an understanding of how we reach this point today.
Well, thank you. And I think I'll take the largest chunk of time, geologic time. I think it's really geography that has the largest explanatory power here. And Afghanistan's position really defined by the Hindu Kush mountain range. And 2 major rivers, the Indus River and Amu Darya River, have historically both led to Afghanistan's geographical definition, but in the middle of surrounding civilizations, particularly the settled civilizations of Iran and India, which Afghanistan combines many cultural elements from, as well as the nomadic civilizations of Central Asia that have historically also had a large cultural impact on Afghanistan. So I think geography, culture. The third, I think, pillar for understanding Afghanistan would be empires. That would be the British Empire, which was responsible in many direct ways for configuring Afghanistan with its boundaries as we know them today. And those imperial projections continue, of course, through the Soviet. And I think it's important to position the American engagement in Afghanistan from an imperial history perspective. So with that in mind, it's important to recognize the Americans have been very much involved in Afghanistan since the Cold War, well before 9/11 in a kind of public way. And then, of course, the Soviet period brought a lot of covert United States actions, very different than the economic development of the Cold War. So a real kind of complex history of United States imperial actions, I think, are explanatory.
Excellent. So that's a bit of the history. So you've noted quite a few things there, right? So the British presence in Afghanistan, obviously the British eventually left. I guess they changed Afghanistan in many ways, as you noted, even the borders, but they eventually lost it and left. And then the Soviet Union invaded and was there for many years and caused immense destruction, and were defeated by rebels within the country who were in many cases supported by the American government. And then the Soviet Union left and actually collapsed. And then the 90s, Professor, tell us a bit about what happened in the 90s and talk to us a bit about the formation of these different groups. So we had Ahmed Massoud's group, we have the Taliban. Can you tell us a bit about what happened in the 90s so we have an understanding of kind of the history of these groups that are still major players in Afghanistan?
Well, certainly. And one immediate problem that we should all recognize is that the United States engagement with the Mujahideen groups, their various leaders, their various organizations, the various state mediators, particularly Pakistan, but also Saudi Arabia and other Arab nations, really occurred below public access. It's covert operations, which really impedes the general public's understanding of these processes. But journalists and historians have been able to determine that it's really and the CIA is not a single thing either. They have a lot of different interests in Afghanistan, ranging from the drug trade, opium sort of trade, to anti-Soviet armaments. And so this 1980s and 90s period really involved the identification of a number of personalities, as you mentioned, Ahmad Shah Massoud, but Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and many others rose to the fore during this period. Indeed, traveled throughout mosques in the United States. I remember one of the leaders named Sayyaf appearing in the mosque in Madison when I was there as an undergraduate.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I mean, the point really is that there was a globalization of the anti-Soviet jihad during this period, that the legacy of which is really strongly evident today. And I think this period broadly is kind of the embryo for the Taliban that emerge in many ways in reaction to some of the excesses of these Mujahideen parties. And we're talking about the kinds of excesses involving forced depopulation, confiscation of property, and these kinds of, and indeed sexual violence that the Taliban used as sort of a springboard to reacting against the Mujahideen and eventually, as you know, becoming the rulers of Kabul. So.
And yeah, in fact, I'd read, and this is correct, that one of the original ways the Taliban rallied support in the 90s was to oppose the sexual abuse of young boys. That this is a kind of an odd fringe cultural thing, and they kind of fought against that early on, and that was one of the things that made them somewhat popular. I don't know, is that true or not? Do you know?
I've heard that as well. I think it's documented in some form, but my reference to sexual violence was kind of multi-gendered. Not just bachabazi is what you're referring to. No, I'm talking about really horrific incidences of indeed rape that are really leave a very difficult social residue to work through. So that period was very disruptive culturally, economically, politically, militarily.
Gotcha. All right, so much history there. So we've talked a little bit about the British, the Soviet Union, the communist era, the fight against that. In the 90s, you got these different personalities. The Taliban emerges from that, takes control of the country. Now, the United States, as you said, has been involved for decades in different ways, and we've been involved militarily over the past 20 years. It seems, Professor, that our political leaders in America are just stunned at what has happened in the past 11 days. So I'd ask you, what did American officials, and by the way, analysts in the media and elsewhere, what did they get wrong about Afghanistan? What have they gotten wrong in the past 20 years, and what did they get wrong, that could lead to this shocking turn of events?
Well, a number of things, and this is in some ways a failure of imperial knowledge. And so I think the most important, conceptual failure is to view Afghanistan as a polity that's dominated by Pashtuns on the one hand, but also a failed state on the other hand. And those are really hard to reconcile, because if a state is failed, then how does it really dominate anything? So I think there's a very foundational misunderstanding about the role of ethnicity and ethnic relations. The primacy on Kabul as the sort of central nerve center for Afghan politics has been belied by other urban and rural spaces. And so I think beyond broad sort of conceptual framing of Afghanistan as a strong, ethnically strong but politically weak, or whatever the contradiction there is, I think there's an overconfidence, at least in since 9/11, in two things. One is technology. This was supposed to be a smart war with drones and all kinds of, we hear smart bombs and precision bombing, which is really a misnomer. But an overconfidence in technology and an over-reliance on cash and money as a sort of, a political variable in its own right. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So those would be my first observations.
Yeah. So that's interesting, Professor. So, I think what you're getting at there is that, I think back to Iraq, when not all the things, but one of the things the U.S. military did to turn the tide after the surge, and was to really hand out money to political leaders in the Anbar province and elsewhere. And that wasn't the only reason, but that helped to some extent. But I guess if you're paying for someone's loyalty, that only gets you so far. And I assume the soldiers on the ground aren't necessarily reaping the benefits of that, so they're only going to sacrifice themselves up to a point. What do you think on that?
Well, sure. And I think it's not just a matter of local fighters or regional commanders, but the sort of the pinnacle of the political system, whether it's heads of state like Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani, or the American mediator, Zalmay Khalilzad, they sort of adopted the imperial language of money politics, as it were. And what this sort of speaks to is that the Afghan political environment is full of relational contingencies, and the idea of permanent allies that can be bought was I think a fatal intellectual flaw in the project.
Interesting. And all right, and we are seeing the results of that to some extent. Now, next question for you, Professor. So, the Afghan American community in the United States, we've been consulting with them and listening to them, and we're hearing a diversity of opinions. Fear for their friends and relatives in Afghanistan in a situation that's still unstable. We've heard some people who are, felt the Afghan government that just collapsed was corrupt, and they're happy to see it go, but they're not happy about the Taliban. So they don't have a winner in the game. and then others that are hopeful that the war will end, that at least the physical violence will end, and Afghanistan can build some sort of new future with their people. So we've heard all sorts of different views. So from your estimation, what are some of the reactions we're seeing in the Afghan American community? And even if you want to share, if you have any knowledge of some of the different reactions in Afghanistan itself, we'd love to get some insight into what people are thinking. We hear so much about what American policymakers think. What's kind of the different sentiments in the Afghan and Afghan American community?
Well, of course, this is a large number of people, maybe a couple 100,000. That may be an overestimate, but certainly over 100,000 Afghans in this country, Afghan Americans. And of course, many of them got involved in the post 9/11 war in Afghanistan. And the fundamental, harmony, if there is any harmony in that community voice, is to adopt kind of American policy perspectives towards local governance as well as the Taliban. So I think despite variations in what Afghan Americans might think about the current situation, there seems to be, again, a concordance between those views and US policy views. And this is, I think, very understandable for largely, an immigrant community that arrived here mainly in the 1980s and 90s in the context of the Soviet invasion. And, I think sort of loyalty to a host country is an explanatory variable there. But I haven't seen a lot of dissent towards the American policy towards Afghanistan broadly in the Afghan American community, and I've certainly not been in touch with every source of information there. Okay. Now, within Afghanistan, I think let's also just really appreciate that this was 20 years of sort of nonstop bombardment from the air. And I just want to emphasize the air war here, because it really is a very different phenomenon. The American war was won really through the air, okay? And whether that's Black Hawk helicopters at night in night raids, drones, or B-52s, this was an air war preponderantly. And the experience of that is terrorizing and disorienting, okay? The Taliban have no air power. Their war is on motorcycle wheels primarily and rifles. You can kind of see the enemy if the Taliban are your enemy. You may even have a chance to negotiate some movement or through a checkpoint.
Escape or something, yeah.
You may be able to, you may not.
Yeah.
But the point is, you can see the Taliban. The American air war was invisible. You can't negotiate with a drone. And so I think that experience of different kinds of military presence are, the point is, there may be a large sigh of relief throughout the vast majority of Afghanistan with the air war largely over, okay? But again, there's a great deal of difference here between different parts of the country, between urban and rural spaces, et cetera.
Gotcha. That's a very interesting point. I mean, we haven't talked about that a lot in the media. Not only the terror that people experienced, yes, from the Taliban, I mean, suicide bombings and the other attacks, but also from these airstrikes by the United States military that have killed. I mean, we don't even know how many people. I mean, we've heard of wedding parties being destroyed and other innocent people being killed, and it's been a significant number of people, and that's a traumatic thing to have to live with. So I think it's an interesting point. There may be a sigh of relief that at least the air war is over. Whatever else might happen next in terms of civil conflict within Afghanistan, no one hopefully has to worry about a drone, out of nowhere blowing up their wedding party.
Let's also be clear, Edward, that at least President Biden's pronouncements, the Americans fully intend to maintain what they called over-horizon capabilities, which means
potential for a continued airstrike.
Still on the table, very much. So that's a tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, and we've seen that from Yemen to Pakistan, Afghanistan. It just doesn't work well. We've seen far more innocent people killed than supposed militants, and we don't even know who they're killed, so we don't even know whether they really were militants. And again, it's their, there's so many issues you could raise that legally and morally what's happening with these.
Absolutely. I thank you for mentioning the comparative use of drones in other contexts. In Yemen and Pakistan and Somalia. It's really so. Afghanistan was the testing ground for this. Afghanistan has been a testing ground for military technology. It's been a testing ground for a lot of these, kind of the ugly underside of the global war on terror with black sites and renditions. And, the Afghanistan is the cradle for that kind of experimentation.
Yeah. Professor, let me ask you one more question before we shift to the second part of the program. So you mentioned earlier that, Afghan Americans, whatever their opinions, they obviously, being from Afghanistan originally or descended from people from Afghanistan originally, they have a great care about their country and the people of the country and the people there. But they also, as Americans, kind of approach it from that American perspective. What role can our government or should our government be playing or not be playing in this situation? So, going forward, what do you think the situation in Afghanistan will mean for the United States and even for countries in the region? You mentioned historically Afghanistan has been critical for geographic reasons to countries in the region. We see China already starting to get involved. So give us, what do you think Afghanistan will mean for America and also people in the region?
All right. Sure. No, maybe let's take the United States first. And in general, there has been a really exponential growth in the sort of militarization of society in so many different ways. Let me take January 6th as one example, where it appears that about 15% of those capital insurrectionists who have been arrested have ties to the military, meaning Afghanistan and Iraq. That number of 15% is kind of approximated in Congress itself, where there's about 15 to 20% military veterans. And this speaks to the general militarization of the body politic here, which is a very important consequence of the global war on terror. Economically, the global war on terror has been inordinately expensive. The national debt, the focus on military spending at the expense of other programs like infrastructure, education, healthcare, is a dramatic problem that I think military spending can't continue to increase disproportionately to these other things, or else we are in great trouble here. And I think, we can leave it at the political and economic, but also the sort of cultural impact of this perpetual war. Particularly, this war is conducted against Muslims. It's so important to remember that. Regionally, again, because of the variety of kind of ideologies on the periphery of Afghanistan, you mentioned China, and China does seem poised and is well ensconced in the minerals of Afghanistan. The large copper mine southeast of Kabul is just a huge example of Chinese influence. The Taliban must be understood not as only Afghans, but Pakistanis and other Saudi role in the creation of the Taliban. I would say Pakistan's strategic depth, as it's always tried to view Afghanistan, has been increased through the Taliban. I think that in turn relates to India's policies. India will remain a heavy, active player in Afghanistan, I believe. Iran may be the, if there is not a wild card per se, but the Talibs are Sunni Muslims aggressively so, and the Hazara and Qizilbash communities of Afghanistan have close ties to Iran, and I don't know what that will mean for Iran. Russia has also, I think, now an opening to advance its interests there. So with the decline of the United States, there will be, I think, not a uniform vacuum that will be competed over. But I think the history of Afghanistan is sort of various sectors of the economy and polity being connected to various external players. So I think that will continue in some form.
Gotcha. Very interesting, Professor. Look, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this more in-depth discussion of things, and from a perspective of an expert. We really appreciate it. There's so much more to discuss. Hopefully we can have you on again as events continue to develop and get more in-depth. But we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor. And now we're going to shift. So we know about what's happening in Afghanistan. We've learned a little more today. And that situation there has sparked discussion in America once again about the issue of Sharia law, women's rights in Islam, and other such things, right? You've seen so many individuals in the media and political leaders trying to equate the Taliban's understanding and interpretation of Islam with the definitive interpretation of Islam. And we've also seen people just misusing Islamic terms and misdefining Islamic terms right and left, and engaging in just utter hypocrisy from the people who will get upset about Afghan women being forced to wear a burqa, but then at the same time will celebrate Muslim women in France being criminalized if they choose to cover their face, trying to have it both ways. So anyway, we want to continue part 2, which is to break down some of these misconceptions about Islam in particular, Sharia, what it means, and women's rights in Islam. This will be an ongoing discussion. Clearly, even after 20 years of education, there's still more to be done. And so, inshallah, we're going to continue that discussion now. Let's bring on our next guest. Very happy to welcome on Sister Azima Abdul-Azim. Sister Azima, welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me, Mitchell.
Thank you so much for joining us. So let me introduce you briefly. Again, it won't be brief because you've got quite a history as well. But Ms. Abdul-Azim was born in Kandahar, Afghanistan. When the Russian government invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Ms. Abdul-Azim and her family came to the United States as war refugees. She grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area until she attended the University of California at Davis, where she earned a BS in biochemistry. After college, she shifted her focus to sacred knowledge by studying at Zaytuna Institute, now I believe Zaytuna College, the University of Damascus, and Zainab Academy Online, where she completed their Alama program. Sister Abdul-Azim is the founder and principal of Dean Sprout Academy, a part-time online Islamic school for Muslim children. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and 3 children. Again, Ms. Abdul-Azim, so happy to have you with us. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll note that Abdul-Azim is the last name my father adopted after he embraced Islam, mashallah. So beautiful name, alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. So let's dive into the discussion. So you've been watching the news. So hopefully you haven't for the sake of your mental health. But if you have been, you're well aware that we've been seeing Islamic terms being thrown left and right and misused left and right, none more so than the term Sharia, which is often referred to as Sharia law in American discourse. So Ms. Abdul-Azim, can you start with us just telling us and our viewers, what is Sharia? And the way I posed this question on our program Monday, I said to our guests, if someone, an average American on the street, came to you and said, what's Sharia law? Like they know very little about it, just what they hear on Fox News, what would you say? But also, we'd love for you to go a little more in depth, to someone who is a little more educated, is a little more open-minded, and really wants to understand what Sharia actually means. What do Muslims understand it to mean, right? What's the authentic understanding of this phrase and its meaning in Islamic discourse? Take it away. Share your thoughts.
All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sharia is a code of law that is rooted in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him. And it aims to achieve justice, fairness, and mercy. The Sharia is very vast and diverse. There are a lot of differences of opinions and rulings, and these differences are celebrated and not shunned. So you can have a lenient interpretation of a ruling or a strict interpretation. Having said that, it is important to clarify that the core of the Sharia is not open to differences of opinions, such as taking one's life. There's no difference of opinion. Taking one's life is not allowed by the Sharia. But the auxiliary rulings, there are differences of opinion. So it's very nuanced. The Sharia is a vast body of rules and regulations that one can use to live by.
Alhamdulillah. So thank you. So, when a Muslim when we pray 5 times a day, when we fast in the month of Ramadan, when we pay our zakat annually, right? When we don't eat pork and we don't drink alcohol, we are following, you could say, the rules of Sharia. Just like, for example, a Catholic, if they are, observing Lent or Ash Wednesday, or a Jewish person observing the Sabbath, following canon law and halakha, respectively, in their personal life. Is that a fair analogy?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, very well. So tell us this. So I think, Ms. Abdul-Azim, when most Americans think of Sharia, they automatically think of criminal law and criminal punishments, right? Punishment for theft, the punishment for this and that and this and that. Can you tell us can we go a little broad here and say, what are the 5 objectives of Sharia? That when they're in English, obviously it's described in different ways, but however you want to describe, what are those 5 main objectives of Sharia, of Islamic law, of this body of law?
Sure. So if you don't mind, I'll go in depth into each one.
Please, go for it. We love it.
So there are 5 objectives, as you've mentioned, Mr. Mitchell. The first one is the protection of life. Life is a gift from God. It's sacred. So therefore, it needs to be protected. The value of human life is beautifully illustrated in one of the chapters of the Quran called Surah Al-Ma'idah in verse 32, where the gist of the verse is that if one kills a life, it is equivalent to killing the entire humanity. And if one saves a life, it is equivalent to saving the entire humanity. So the preservation of life is essential. Sharia forbids killing and metes out severe punishments for killing human beings. So that's the first objective of Sharia. Another objective of Sharia is preserving or protecting lineage or progeny. Sharia aims to protect children. Every child has the right to grow up in a family. Raising and nurturing a child is the obligation of the family. So that takes us to marriage. Marriage is an integral part of Sharia. And things which can potentially destroy a marriage are punishable by the Sharia, such as spreading rumors about a person. And divorce is allowed by Islam, but it is discouraged. But it is allowed. So it's kind of like the final resort. So Sharia pays special attention to the family unit, the nuclear family unit. And one of the reasons is to ensure that children grow up in healthy families. And that brings us to children who don't have families, orphans. Orphans are very valuable and taking care of orphans is rewarded highly. So Sharia basically aims to make sure that children's needs are met and that they have righteous upbringing. So therefore, the protection of lineage and progeny is one of the objectives of Sharia. Another objective of the Sharia is the protection of property. We all have the right to own wealth, and we have the right to protect our wealth. Therefore, theft is strictly prohibited and punishable by Sharia. The Sharia encourages us to increase our wealth, and the poor have a right in our wealth to a certain extent through charity, through zakah. And therefore, the protection of property is an objective of the Sharia. Another aim of the Sharia is the protection of intellect. The intellect is a beautiful gift from God. It differentiates us from animals. The Sharia makes sure that our intellect is a sort of source of benefit to the society. Therefore, the Sharia promotes education for all and makes it a right of every human being. Sharia does not allow things which can corrupt one's intellect, such as intoxicants. So if one's intellect is corrupted, it becomes harmful to the person and the society at large. So the protection of the intellect is another aim of the Sharia. And the last one is the protection of faith or religion. Faith is what makes us different than other creation of Allah. It's an honor to have faith, and it is bestowed upon the human being by Allah, and therefore it needs to be protected. So compulsion in faith is against the Sharia. A major goal behind the rituals in Islam is to strengthen one's faith and one's relationship between him or her and our Creator. So our faith is an integral part of our life, and it is one of the objectives of the Sharia to protect our faith. So these are the 5 objectives of the Sharia.
Thank you so much for giving that in-depth explanation of each one. And I asked you that question because, again, most people wouldn't think of that, right? Your average person who's not familiar with Islam, they don't think of protecting life and property and family and religion and intellect. That is not what they realize or think of when the discussion of Sharia comes up. They immediately jump to the criminal issues, which you mentioned. So thank you for addressing it. Now, the next question I like to ask you, which is that you've talked a bit about the diversity of opinion, right? That on fundamental issues, like we all pray 5 times a day. I don't think any Muslim, no one disputes that we pray the required prayers, 5 prayers a day, right? That killing yourself, you're depressed or you're sad or you're killing yourself, not acceptable, right? There are basic fundamental things, many things that are fundamental that are not disputed. Talk to us a bit, if you can, Ms. Abdul-Azim, about women's rights. Obviously, in different countries and in different cultures, women's rights in Islam might be interpreted a little differently. But what are some of the fundamental things in the Sharia that guarantee the rights and protection of women?
So the Sharia gives women the right to an education, the right to marry the person of her choice, to retain her identity after her marriage, the right to ask for a divorce, the right to own property, the right to work, the right to vote, the right to participate in civic and political engagement, the right to inherit, and the right to be a free-thinking human being. The Sharia affords us all of these rights.
And what's so strange, Ms. Abdul-Azim, is that, again, number one, the rights that, if you would just compare history, I mean, if you look at American history and the rights that women had in this country 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, and then compare them to the rights that the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ guaranteed 1400 years ago, I think you'll see a gap. I think you could say that Western society is caught up to Islamic society and Islamic teachings in many ways, and in some ways. But it's very important to mention. Now, what do you say, Ms. Abdul-Azim, to people who say, well, hold on. Islam was progressive, 1,000 years ago by comparison, but now in 2021, the rights that Islam guarantees to women, it's not enough, and that there are horrible things that can be done to women under Islamic law. What do you say to the critics? And they'll, for example, they'll point to the Taliban and say, look, the Taliban is making women. Well, this is what they did. They're not doing this right now, supposedly, but back in the 90s, they would make women wear burqas, right? And they said that they did not say that was a cultural thing. They insisted that was Islamic law. So what do you say to that, to these different interpretations, and also the critics who say, no, I'm not buying it. Islam is hostile to women. What do you say to the critics?
I would say these misconceptions are rooted in ignorance. I think I would encourage people who have these misconceptions to educate themselves about Islam. And yes, the Taliban were in the 90s very oppressive. I don't know how they will be now. We'll see. They were requiring women to wear burqas, and they were saying it's rooted in Islam, but Islam does not tell women to wear burqas. Islam dictates modest attire.
For men and women.
For men and women.
Yep.
And so that is open to interpretation in terms of what kind of attire. The modesty part is not open to interpretation. But in Afghanistan, women wear burqa to cover themselves, whereas in Saudi, they dress differently. In Indonesia, they dress differently. And, in Iran, they dress differently. So that part is, open to interpretation. Islam allows us to wear, either long dresses or a long shirt and pants or burqas or jilbab or whatever. But the point is modesty. So if a group of people take a specific interpretation or a strict interpretation of this ruling, that doesn't mean that represents the entire deen, the entire Islam, the Sharia. That's just one strict interpretation of it. What you need to do is look at the entire Muslim body in the world. How are they how are Muslim women dressing themselves elsewhere? So if Islam said that all women had to wear burqas, how come the rest of the Muslim women in the world are not wearing burqas?
Yeah.
So I think educating oneself helps a lot. Learning about these issues from properly trained scholars, not from the internet, but from proper sources, from qualified sources, that will dispel a lot of the myths.
Excellent point. And I think, a very interesting point you make there. So even in the governments that attempt to or say they are enforcing Islamic law, when they look at your dress code, it's very different. So Saudi Arabia has one requirement. Iran has a different requirement. Afghanistan back in the 90s, they had a different requirement. You see even variation. And so the point here is that when media outlets, and we've seen this, say that what the Taliban is doing is definitively Sharia, that's not really correct. It's an interpretation of Sharia, just like what the Saudis do is an interpretation, what the Iranians do, and even what we do in our personal lives to some extent is an interpretation. And sometimes that's influenced by, correct me if your school of thought, the country you live in, the culture you grew up in, that these things can obviously consciously or subconsciously influence how you interpret Sharia. But in theory, we're all trying to get to the correct interpretation, what is correct in the sight of God, and we are not obviously divine, and so we're going to have different interpretations. We're human beings, and so we end up at different results. But as you said, the key thing, Mr. Abdul-Azim, is the modesty and coloring within those lines that are very clear in Islamic law. Let me ask you this. So you mentioned earlier the issue of violence, right? So another common misperception is that Islam is just a violent religion, and uniquely violent at that. I mean, people act as if there aren't stories of war in the Bible and directions about war in the Bible and rules, but that's an aside. But they claim that Sharia and Islam and all this violent and terroristic and all this stuff. So can you talk to us about the rules, the general rules that are recognized of conflict in Islamic law? So for example, there's that famous the rules of battle that an early Muslim leader laid out to his army before they went into what was considered a legitimate, justified struggle, saying, don't kill women, don't kill children, don't kill clergy, don't burn down a tree, don't harm animals. Can you talk to us a bit about, Islam is a peaceful way of life, but it's not a pacifistic way of life, right? There we can, the Muslim community can defend themselves, and there were obviously times in which Muslims went to war for just reasons, but there were rules of war in the Sharia that had to be followed and that terrorist groups today disregard at will. Can you talk to us about some of the rules of conflict that I dare say many Western countries do not even follow in their own wars today?
Absolutely. Societies at large have one set of rules, and then when you're in conflict with another state, there's a different set of rules. And in those set of rules, it doesn't mean that all the societal rules are put aside. When there's a conflict, a Muslim soldier is only supposed to fight the enemy who's fighting you face to face. So the enemy's family is off limits because the enemy's family is not fighting you. And the enemy's property is off limits because you're not supposed to destroy their property. You're not supposed to burn down crops and fields, and you're not supposed to touch the clergy. And it's people who are not fighting one are safe from Muslims. Muslim soldiers are only supposed to fight the enemy who's fighting them face to face. So that's, that's in comparison to most of the other countries that engage in warfare. This is a very civil way of fighting. Unfortunately, in the US, we've come to a day and age where bombs are dropped from a plane, and to the pilot, it's kind of like a video game. They don't even see the person's face that they're killing. So it doesn't even have that much of an impact on their heart. Had they been on the ground, seeing the people that they're shooting, that they're killing, they may not have done it so, but it's so because it's become so, they're so detached from the people that they're killing, it's become easier for them to kill. But Muslims in the past, when they have fought, they were by and large very fair in their tactics and very merciful, if you will, and as opposed to other societies.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most famous Muslim leaders in post-prophetic times, is Salahuddin, who took back and rescued and liberated Jerusalem from the Crusaders. And he is beloved not only to Muslims, but widely respected in the West because of how he carried himself on and off the battlefield and his treatment of the people that he was fighting against. And so if you respect Salahuddin, if you found him to be a noble example of a Muslim, well, Salahuddin was only trying to emulate those who came before him, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and other early Muslims. And he certainly was not known as good as them. And so if you like him, you got to like what came before, because he was only trying to emulate what came before. And we see that example in others. For example, in the 20th century, Omar Mukhtar is respected, obviously, in the Muslim world, but also elsewhere for the respect that he showed the Italians that he was fighting against during the attempt to liberate Libya, even though they did not deserve it. They were doing horrible things to the people of Libya. And yet, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Abdul-Azim, one of his men asked him, why they would not execute Italian prisoners they had captured, because the Italians do that to the Muslims when they capture them. And he said, they are not the Italians. They are not our teachers, right? We do not, treat other people badly because they treat us badly. We treat other people the way we are supposed to treat them, regardless of what they do to us. So that's something that I think, many Muslims now who are in armies and in militaries, and they forget those lessons, and they have let the hatred of others kind of take over their hearts and lead to horrific violence. And we can hope that people will get closer to this Islamic ideal when conflict does have to arise, that it is addressed within the bounds of Islamic law. Okay, Ms. Abdul-Azim, let me ask you one last question, then we'll let you go, inshallah. Thank you so much for staying with us for this extended program. What advice would you give to other Muslims and masajid who want to dialogue with other people about misconceptions they may have about Sharia? Like your average Muslim is not an expert on this. They may or may not know the 5 objectives of Sharia, but they know their religion. They know the basics. What advice do you give them for how to explain some of these issues to their neighbors if these conversations come up?
Unfortunately, each Muslim has come to the point in their life that they represent their entire religion to the West, whether they like it or not. So I think, having said that, it's important that we take a little bit of time and educate ourselves about our religion and understand the Sharia, understand why certain laws are there, and why the mass media portrays Sharia a certain way, and then maybe start dispelling those myths. And I think it's important that we talk to our neighbors. If we engage with our neighbors, as our religion dictates that we are supposed to be kind to our neighbors, if we show kindness to our neighbors, and then they may have questions they will pose to us, then we can explain whatever questions they may have. We can explain the answer to them, and that may dispel some myths. There are a lot of people out there who just don't know a Muslim. And once they meet a Muslim, they get to know them, then they're like, oh, you guys are not as weird as we thought you were. So I think it's important to adhere to our own values in being kind and being respectful, and also have a certain amount of knowledge so that we can educate anyone who interacts with us, whether it's our neighbor or someone at the grocery store or someone at school or university. The first thing is to adhere to our values in being very, very respectful and kind and merciful and patient. We should be a little patient. There's a lot of anger out there, unfortunately, and a lot of it is directed to us. And we have to remind ourselves that none of this is in a vacuum, that Allah wanted this for us, and that there is a higher goal to achieve here. So if we try to be patient and try to alleviate some of that stress in a fellow human being, and try to explain to them that, we're just a human being like you, and our values are such and such, and they'll realize that we have a lot in common, and that will help us in our akhirah. It will help us here, and it'll help us in our akhirah.
Absolutely. Inshallah. Thank you so much, Ms. Abdul-Azim. We greatly appreciate your time today and your guidance and your perspective in this information. And we hope, inshallah, the community will benefit from it and our neighbors will benefit from it as well. We hope to bring you back one day to discuss these issues more in depth. There's so much more we could talk about, but I think, alhamdulillah, we've covered some of the major important things we needed to discuss today. So thank you so much for joining us. Jazakallah khair.
Wa yakum. Thank you for having me.
Alhamdulillah. And thank you all for watching this extended episode of CAIR on Air, the Muslim Action Hour. We greatly appreciate it. We discussed two major topics today, Afghanistan and the issue of Islamic terminology. Inshallah, we'll be continuing these conversations in the future. Again, if you have any topics you want us to address, email us at info@cair.com. That's info@cair.com. Inshallah, we'll see you next Tuesday at 3 p.m. for the next episode of the show. Until then, assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you.